e bem-vindos a uma nova edição do Caminhos para o Mundo, um programa do Brasil de Fato em parceria com a Assembleia Internacional dos Povos, que traz sempre temas relevantes e atuais sobre a política internacional e a luta dos movimentos populares do mundo. No programa de hoje, vamos discutir o que é o imperialismo e se existe uma nova configuração das relações internacionais e da chamada governança global. O sistema econômico mundial atingiu sua fase imperialista, o que para alguns autores significa que o momento é de maior acumulação de capital na mão de poucos, de incentivo ao latifúndio e concentração de terras e aumento das disputas por territórios e recursos naturais. E tudo isso às custas de mais desigualdade, fome e miséria em todo o mundo. De acordo com a ONU, cerca de 274 milhões de pessoas em todo o planeta precisam de ajuda humanitária. O acirramento das disputas entre os super ricos e as potências econômicas globais sugere a iminência de novos conflitos armados e o aprofundamento da crise internacional. Com a eclosão do conflito armado entre Rússia e Ucrânia, o mundo parece entrar numa nova fase geopolítica e o medo de uma terceira guerra mundial volta a estar presente. Para aprofundar esse tema, conversamos com Vijay Prashad. Vijay, seja muito bem-vindo.
Thanks a lot. It's nice to be here. Yeah.
Vijay Prashad é historiador e jornalista. Ele é natural de Calcutá, na Índia, e coordena o Instituto Tricontinental de Pesquisa Social e a editora Leftward. Possui uma obra de clara orientação marxista, com cerca de 20 livros publicados. Seu último lançamento é de 2020, chamado Balas de Washington, uma história da CIA, golpes e assassinatos. Para começar, eu queria te perguntar, para você, o que é o imperialismo e como ele se expressa no mundo hoje?
So there's a couple of ways to answer that question. Let's start with how we experience something like imperialism. You see, the world has 7.9 billion people. There are some countries with 10, 15 million, relatively small populations. These countries decide we want to exercise our sovereignty over our raw materials. We want to create a project of food sovereignty. We want to grow food ourselves. We want our people to live in dignity and so on. And as the country begins to advance this process, suddenly the leader of the process is assassinated, or the military is told to leave the barracks and overthrows the government, or sanctions come against that country and the country is suffocated, not allowed to get, foreign exchange or to trade openly and so on. Why are there assassinations of leaders? Why are there coup d'etats? Why are there sanctions against countries? Well, powerful parts of the world have, in a sense, decided that the international system has to be structured to benefit global capital. And that if 1, 2, 3 countries decide that, look, we want to create our own path, they might set an example for other countries. Now, what is a country doing when it says we want to exercise sovereignty? What it's doing is it says we want a better payment for our raw materials. It could be copper, could be lithium, could be oil. We want a better price. They may also say we want our workers to get a higher wage. What gives a country outside the right to come in and say, no, your copper must be at this low level? Or no, your workers in your country can't be paid a higher wage. Well, what this outside force is doing is it's essentially maintaining lowered prices for raw materials, which benefits big corporations, and it's maintaining lowered levels of wages, global wages for big corporations to benefit. Now, I'm not giving just a hypothetical scenario. The government of Haiti, one of the poorest countries in the world, tried to raise minimum wages, and the US government intervened through the ambassador to prevent the Haitian legislature, the Congress, from lifting wages. That's amazing. Thomas Sankara tried to get a better deal for the people of Burkina Faso, overthrown in a coup d'etat. Venezuela tried to develop a new approach for its people regarding, oil prices and what it should do with the oil money, sanctioned, attempted coup d'etat. Well, people say imperialism doesn't exist. If imperialism does not exist as a structuring principle, why do we have coups? Why do we have assassinations? Why do we have sanctions? Can you explain to me with some other theory why that is so?
Houve alguma mudança nas características do imperialismo mundial após ano de gestão de Joe Biden?
Imperialism doesn't really count on changes in the political leadership in the powerful countries of the world. Whether it's Mr. Trump or Mr. Biden or Mr. Obama or Mr. Bush, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because there's a structure in the world system that has to be maintained. Look, we can discuss why the United States is so completely focused on overthrowing the government in Cuba. Cuba is a very small country, 11 million people. Why can't the United States just say, do whatever you want, Cuba? You want to develop a socialist system, do whatever you want. It's just 11 million people. The population of Cuba is smaller than the population of New York City. And yet the United States is obsessed with overthrowing the government in Cuba. Why? Because they have not been able, since 1959, they have not been able, they don't want to allow any country like Cuba to develop a socialist model. If Cuba succeeds, again, it's contagious. It sends a message to Haiti, to the Dominican Republic, to Jamaica, to all these countries, small island countries in the Caribbean will say, hey, listen, look at Cuba. They have universal health care. They have excellent education system. Already Cuba is a model for many people. Imagine if there was no blockade of Cuba, what could be done in Cuba. So it's not a question of Biden or Obama. It's a structure. And that structure has been in place for a very long time.
Ascensão da China, que deve se tornar a maior potência econômica mundial em 2025, ainda é possível falar que o mundo está sob a influência de uma superpotência, ou seja, os Estados Unidos?
Let's take two different vectors of power, okay? Let's look at two vectors of power. The first vector of power is military power. No country has the military capacity of the United States. United States has 800 military bases in 80 countries around the world. China does not have 800 military bases. At most, and it's really quite a stretch to call these bases, at most it has 2 bases in Djibouti, in the Horn of Africa, and those bases are naval bases to support the UN mission against piracy. They're not really military bases to challenge the United States. China does not have military bases in the Caribbean or in, Mexico or Central America, in Canada. My God, that's a fantasy, right? United States, overwhelming military force, about $1 trillion spent every year on the budget, including the nuclear budget and the intelligence budget and so on, far in advance of everybody else's military budget combined virtually. Okay, so there's no question that when it comes to military power, there's no contest. The United States is the most powerful. It can destroy a country. It may not be able to govern the country. It's destroyed Afghanistan. It can't govern it, but it's destroyed Afghanistan. Second vector of power is financial power. United States controls the principal institutions of trade and development. This includes trade with the financial sector. So if you need to send money out of country A to country B, you're going to have to use the international banking system. That means you're going to have to use the SWIFT system. The SWIFT system is based in Brussels, in Belgium. Now, it's basically under the authority of the US Treasury Department. And when the US sanctions a country, it can easily cut you off from the SWIFT system. It's hard to reconcile trade. When it comes to development, most of the international development agencies, the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, and so on, they follow the rules of the United States Treasury Department. Now, here in development, there is a challenge. The Chinese Belt and Road is a serious challenge to the US IMF, approach to development. But still, even here, countries which are joining the Belt and Road Initiative continue to hold their assets in dollars, not in yuans or renminbi or rubles or euros. They might have some rubles, some euros, some renminbi, but up to 50% of most countries' wealth is held in the US dollar. That's going to be hard to change, because if two countries are trading with each other and one country has a trade surplus and it's holding some other currency, it's holding, say, the Cuban peso, you'll have to rely on a third country to accept the peso. Otherwise, you'll just be sitting on, pesos, and nobody wants them. That's why countries use the dollar. And so it's hard to go beyond the dollar. So yeah, China is a very powerful country and so on. It's not able to easily supplant the power of the United States.
A pandemia acelerou uma situação generalizada de crise em todo o planeta, com aumento da miséria, fome, desemprego. Em outros períodos históricos, para dar um novo respiro ao capitalismo, foram desatados conflitos armados. Diante dessa situação que a gente vê hoje de crise, faz sentido temer uma terceira guerra mundial?
I mean, I'm not sure that we're going to necessarily go into a third world war. I don't think necessarily. I think the conflict in Ukraine is a conflict between, in a way, the United States and the great Eurasian powers. There's a very great tension on between Russia, China, United States, and so on. There's a lot of moving parts in this. In fact, the Japanese and the Russians have a dispute over some islands that has begun to, be raised by the Japanese government. It's a very serious problem that might appear. I don't think there's a necessity of war. I feel that there's a lot of people upset by the war that's taking place in Ukraine. Many countries, the president of South Africa has been quite clear that he thinks that the West is behaving in a way to actually provoke or accelerate the conflict. I think in other countries as well, in fact, in Brazil, even though the right-wing government of Mr. Bolsonaro is close to the United States, I think they have conflicted feelings about this conflict. Brazil has very close economic ties with China. People don't want to see the kind of fragile world economy disrupted by warfare. Fuel and food prices have already started to go up. So I think there's a large constituency globally, a large constituency that is against this kind of conflict. So I don't think it's inevitable that we'll go into some sort of world war. I hope not. I hope sane minds will prevail. But I do feel that certainly the West is accelerating a pressure campaign against China and Russia, and that's very unfortunate.
Eu gostaria agora de chamar o nosso jornalista convidado de hoje, que tem uma pergunta para você, Vijay. É o Arturo Hartmann, que é editor-chefe de temas internacionais do Brasil de Fato. Arturo, bem-vindo.
Obrigado, Aline. Queria primeiro reforçar aqui, estender os agradecimentos ao Vijay por ter aceitado o nosso convite e estar conversando aqui com a gente nesse episódio dos Caminhos para o Mundo. Minha pergunta, Vijay, vai no seguinte sentido. Dentro dos debates do imperialismo, de que maneira, mais especificamente, a guerra da Ucrânia pode acelerar ou pode incentivar a reformulação da geopolítica mundial? Pensando também como as ações dos Estados Unidos e da Europa de sanções, de buscar fazer um cerco à Rússia e restringir possibilidades de ações russas, como isso pode empurrar ou acelerar a formação de um bloco euroasiático, que seria liderado por Pequim e por Moscou, né? Eu queria saber um pouco o que você acha disso.
I don't think that either Beijing or any of the other countries in Asia are keen on a world division, into a kind of Russia-Chinese pole and a Western pole. They don't want that. I mean, frankly, the Chinese economy is thoroughly integrated with Europe and the United States. So it would cost a lot to the Chinese people if there was like a new iron curtain, that was around the West, say, and there was a break. I think it would cost them a lot. I'm not even sure the Russians are keen on this. I mean, frankly, again, Russia sells a lot of its natural gas to Europe. It wants to continue to sell natural gas. The Europeans continue to buy natural gas despite this conflict. So I feel like the appetite in China and Russia, to create some big break is just not there. The Chinese are very keen on bringing this conflict to an end. So I'm not convinced that there's going to be, these big blocks, divisions in the world. I mean, it's not possible. The level of international suffering would be great. I mean, imagine if Brazil was forced to choose between the United States and a China-Russia bloc. Ask a Brazilian person to go into a market, a shop, and to see how much of the goods in that shop come from China. Where would you get your buckets from? Where would you get your car parts from? Where would you get your computers from? So many of them are built in China. And, at the same time, a considerable amount of trade takes place with the United States, particularly for financiers and so on. So different classes are going to be hit if you had to choose, we want to be in this block or that block. I mean, I really don't think the world is interested right now in being divided up, separated by an iron curtain. I think people understand that globalization has tied people together, economies together, and it's going to be very hard to unravel them. The cost is going to be very high.
Vijay, mas nós vamos ver uma reconfiguração da geopolítica mundial?
Well, the question isn't, is there going to be a change? The question is, how long will it take and what will it look like? I mean, there are always going to be changes. With the rise of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, we're already seeing great changes. Argentina has signed up to join the Belt and Road Initiative. But so did Poland. Poland is a right-wing government. You don't have to be a progressive government to join China's Belt and Road Initiative. These things are very contradictory in a way. Poland joined the Belt and Road Initiative of China in 2015, not for ideological reasons, but practical reasons. They wanted Chinese investment and so on. So, I mean, I just feel like, we're not going to see anything happen immediately. I feel like there is no question that China wants desperately for the war in Ukraine to end and will not be drawn into a conflict. They don't want a military conflict. That could be catastrophic. So I don't think the question is, will there be a shift? The shift is already happening. But what will the shift look like? I don't think it will look like the creation of two worlds. I don't even think it's necessarily going to be multipolarity. I just don't feel like right now it's easy to say what's going to happen. One thing that is going to happen is that the Chinese and others have been saying, let's revive the BRICS. Let's put some life into the BRICS. Now, that'll be interesting. Will the right-leaning government in India, right-wing government in India, and the right-wing government in Brazil pick up the initiative? What will happen in the Brazilian election this year? If the left prevails in Brazil, will it want the BRICS to be reborn? The BRICS has not died, but the BRICS has had less energy in recent years. This could be interesting. I know the South Africans are very interested in reviving the BRICS. See, BRICS is not necessarily anti-Western. It's a those economies are fundamentally integrated to the West. So again, the question isn't, will there be a change? The change is already happening. The question is, at what pace will it take place? And what will it actually look like? I think it's going to look like a web rather than blocks, that are separated. There will be a web. By the way, people should know that during the time of the USSR right through its history traded with the United States. It traded right through its history with the US. It's not like the Iron Curtain actually separated these places. That's not how it operated.
Sob a lógica da multipolaridade, formação de um novo eixo anti-hegemônico, através ali da Rota da Seda, do cinturão, substituição do dólar, também é possível pensar em um novo arranjo das instituições internacionais? Talvez uma reforma das Nações Unidas ou mesmo o fim da OTAN?
Well, I don't think NATO is going to end. In fact, NATO is going to meet in the summer of 2022 in Madrid, and they are going to put out a new concept document which suggests a kind of global NATO. They're on a warpath to become, in a sense, the world's policeman. That's how they see themselves. They're already talking about something called global NATO. United Nations, is a victim of the political differences in the world. It's not an independent actor. If there are enormous political differences, particularly among the so-called great powers, the UN can't act. I mean, on the permanent seats in the Security Council, you have Britain, France, the United States, and Russia and China. So if there's a gap between these two powers, the UN can't act. So it's not fair to say, why isn't the UN... The UN is a victim of the great power divisions in the world. NATO is going to be more powerful. The UN is a victim of the great power divisions. At the same time, I feel like, there will emerge new security challenges for countries. And, I'm hoping very much that regional organizations like the African Union, perhaps, CELAC in Latin America, these regional organizations will step up to the table and say, look, we don't want to choose sides and so on. We want to have a non-aligned, independent foreign policy. It would be very interesting if CELAC in Latin America articulated directly and used the term non-aligned. It would be useful if the African Union did that. It would be useful if, the Southeast Asian organizations did that and so on. I mean, I feel like we're at a point where we want countries to stand up and say, I don't want to choose, rather than have countries choose.
Vijay, como você analisa o crescimento de novas correntes fascistas de extrema-direita no século XXI? Essas correntes são capazes de alcançar países importantes como Estados Unidos, Índia, Brasil. A democracia está sob risco? Quais são as perspectivas para a esquerda hoje?
One of the interesting things is that these forces no longer need to actually conduct coup d'etats to take power. I think they've recognized that. There is a kind of fatal intimacy, very fatal intimacy between the forces of the hard right and these bourgeois institutions, democratic institutions. Sure, they will use lawfare, as they did in Brazil to get rid of Dilma. Well, Dilma was actually legislative fare, they used the legislature, but against Lula, they used the law and so on. I mean, in some countries, they'll do that. Other countries just using money to, overwhelm other political forces to win elections. So one point is that the hard right has recognized they can use, formally democratic institutions to come to power. They don't actually have to have a fascist coup d'etat. That's one thing we need to recognize. Secondly, liberalism has actually collapsed. Liberalism's affinity to privatization, what we call neoliberal policy, has meant that it has, for at least a generation, no answer to the actual material problems people face. And because liberalism doesn't have answers to the actual material problems people face, and because the left is weak, the hard right has been able to emerge. You know, it's a consequence of liberalism's collapse that the hard right has come in, not of the left's collapse. When fascism came in the 20s, it was to attack the left. Now fascism has arrived because liberalism has basically collapsed. Liberalism has become the religion of the elite. And this crowd has emerged essentially because they say that the liberals don't know how to address unemployment and all these issues. And that's one of the great dangers, is that the reason the left has to grow in strength and confidence is that neither the liberals nor the hard right have answers to the problems of humanity. We have some answers. We have to be more aggressive in a way. We can't wait for the liberals to save the day. They are not going to save anything.
Vijay, muito obrigada pela sua participação aqui hoje conosco. Foi um prazer tê-lo no nosso programa. Vijay Prashad, jornalista, escritor, autor de vários livros, inclusive alguns deles já publicados aqui no Brasil. Muito obrigada por estar conosco hoje.
Thanks a lot.
O Caminhos para o Mundo fica por aqui. Para rever este ou outros programas, basta acessar o canal do Brasil de Fato no YouTube e acompanhar a gente também pela TVT. Um grande abraço e até a próxima!